Pokemon is a franchise I guarantee you've heard of. It covers everything from games to cards and even movies and shows. I would love to talk about all forms of media that Pokemon exists in, but that would make this video far too long. Today I'm here to talk about the video game franchise and show you through its extensive history. The history can be split into two parts, the pre-3D era and post-3D era, which I will from here on out refer to as the Classic Era and Modern Era. In this video, I will be covering the Classic Era. The Classic Era of games began with Pokemon Red and Blue, or Red and Green if you're over in Japan. These games came out on the original Game Boy in 1996, which was the very end of the Game Boy's life. Being the first entry in the franchise, it solidified what people expected from these games going forward. One of the biggest factors to the games was the sprites and designs of each Pokemon. While the designs were fine, some of the sprites were something else, to say the least. Like, look at this. What is this supposed to be? Later in 1998, Pokemon Yellow was released, and thankfully some of the sprites were fixed, so they actually look somewhat decent, and like the promotional art. This third version was based off of the anime, which was based off the games, which is interesting to think about, because it's essentially the same thing, but with slight changes. Also Pikachu. Instead of choosing your starter, you're given a Pikachu that follows behind you throughout the game. It's like an early version of having your companion Pokemon walk alongside you, but it's specifically just for that Pikachu. Aside from that, these games are still incredibly broken and barely holding themselves together. Moving on to 1999, Pokemon Gold and Silver release. They added some mainstay mechanics that make the more modern titles what they are today. These entries marked the second generation of Pokemon games, and with it, a decent amount of new Pokemon. Being sequels, Gold and Silver were built off the base of the original Pokemon games, so they still had many of the problems present in Red, Blue, and Yellow, but they also added some of the mainstay features that Pokemon wouldn't be the same without. In these games, you could go back to Kanto, the original region. It was almost like these games were just an expanded version of Red, Blue, and Yellow. Kinda like the DLC they release nowadays. Overall, they didn't add much, but served the purpose of being Pokemon sequels. Pokemon Ruby and Sapphire came out in 2002, marking the start of the third generation of Pokemon. Game Freak decided to completely rework the Pokemon games from the ground up in order to improve on so many of the flaws that the previous games had. Not only were they on smaller cartridges, the graphics also got an upgrade which gave the Pokemon the representation they deserve. They now have beautiful sprites that show off each Pokemon's traits and personality. Another thing introduced in this generation was double battles. It's like regular battles, but more. Usually when you battle someone, there's only one of each of your Pokemon out at a time, but in double battles, it introduces a whole nother element of strategy to the game. Since you have two of your Pokemon out at a time, you have to strategize and attempt to predict what your opponent's going to do, since there's more factors at play. Another mainstay that Ruby and Sapphire introduced is abilities. Every Pokemon gets an ability that does some sort of effect during battle, whether by making it start to rain, or being so intimidating it lowers your opponent's attack stat. Some of the abilities don't always make sense. I'm looking at you, Masquerain. Overall, this is one of my favorite generations because of what it introduced to the series and how crucial it is to the modern games. In 2004, Pokemon Emerald hit the shelves and decided to take the main series of games of this generation and just make them so much better. The plot was expanded upon, now having both evil teams that were version exclusives, having a ton of more post-content like Battle Frontier, and overall just fixing a few small things like Pokemon locations and availability. Also, damn, that's a cool looking dragon. The next games, Pokemon Diamond and Pearl, were a nice refresh for the series, making the combat system better so each and every Pokemon can take advantage of the typing they have, as well as the stat they specialize in. A great example of this is Shiftry, a Pokemon that was introduced in Ruby and Sapphire. Shiftry is a Grass Dark type that specializes in physical attack. In Generation 3, all Grass and Dark type moves were dependent on the Pokemon's special attack stat, so Shiftry couldn't take full advantage of its stats. In Generation 4, moves of every type were split into three categories: physical attack, special attack, and setup moves. Now Shiftry was able to have more of a use and deal more damage since it got physical Dark and Grass type moves now. These games were also on the Nintendo DS, so there was a whole nother screen to work with, which really helped the gameplay feel better. The top screen would have your character moving around the world as well as having the battles show up there, while the menu and move selection were on the bottom screen, out of the way. This design choice really helped since you had no UI covering the screen during your battles. The 5th generation of Pokemon is the most unique. Instead of the standard 2-game release and then a definitive edition later down the line, Game Freak decided to release these two games first, Pokemon Black and White, but then also decided to release sequels later down the line in the form of Pokemon Black 2 and White 2. This generation of Pokemon is widely agreed upon as the best games in the series, which I 100% agree with. The amount of care and detail that went into making those games really shows during the story. The originals and sequels take place a couple years apart, but they're still a continuation of the original game's plot. Pokemon Black and White were originally intended to be a reboot for the Pokemon series, and throughout Pokemon Black and White you won't encounter a single past Pokemon until after you've beaten the game. In the sequels, they changed things a bit so you were able to encounter past Pokemon on your journey throughout the story, but it was an interesting choice to make while developing the game. Another thing about this generation that was new to the series is its tone. Pokemon Black and White were made to have a more mature and much darker tone than any of the other Pokemon games in the series, letting the developers really flesh out the characters, both good and bad. A nice little touch that was added in this generation is animated sprites. Now every time a Pokemon was on screen in battle, they would each have their own animations that play not just when they get sent out, but throughout the entire fight. It gave even more life and personality to each and every Pokemon, which the franchise definitely needed. Overall, the classic era of Pokemon was nothing but improving with each and every game. They had perfected the franchise formula and found something that fans absolutely love to this day. Surely they can't screw up the next games, right?